I was so anxious that I didn't really want to go into the boys' lavatory. It wasn't about seeing body parts or anything, it was just like I felt vulnerable in there.
When Rob Reiner's name comes up now, Rondo isn't rushed to praise or criticize, that he pauses first. That pause matters, it'ls you. This isn't about shock or spectacle. It's about perspective that only comes after a lifetime inside Hollywood. Watching people grow, drift, and sometimes change in ways no one expected at the beginning. Ron Howard grew up in the industry the way few people ever have. As a child actor who became a director, producer, and creative leader, he saw Hollywood from every possible angle. He watched friendships form under pressure, partnerships break quietly, and success reshape people in subtle ways long before the public ever noticed. When Ron thinks about Rob Reiner, he doesn't think in headlines. He thinks in moments, early mornings on sets, conversations that felt easy back then, a shared belief that stories mattered more than statements. In the early days, Ron and Rob came up in a Hollywood that still felt human. It wasn't innocent, but it was curious. Directors argued about pacing, performances, and endings, not about who was right or wrong in the world. There was room to disagree and still respect the craft. Ron remembers Rob Reiner as someone sharp, funny, deeply aware, often and genuinely invested in people. Rob knew how to listen back then, and that made his work resonate. Films weren't vehicles for points. They were experiences meant to connect. What Ron remembers most clearly is how natural everything felt at the start. There was no sense of sides or camps. You worked with people because they were good, not because they agreed with you. Rob Reiner thrived in that environment. His early work reflected warmth, wit, and a deep understanding of human dynamics. Ron admired that. Hest still does. He's careful to say that admiration never disappeared. What changed was the atmosphere around the man, eventually the way people moved inside it. As Hollywood grew louder, Ron noticed how silence became harder to hold. Opinions started traveling faster, then ideas certainly became currency. Ron doesn't sigh this accusingly. He says it the way someone describes a weather shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the temperature changed. Conversations that once felt open began to feel cautious. People started choosing words more carefully. Not for clarity, but for safety. And in that shift, relationships didn't explode, they thinned. Ron Howard never saw Rob Reiner as someone chasing conflict. He saw him as someone who found conviction and stayed there. That difference matters. Conviction can beg rounding, but it can also narrow vision. Ron felt that narrowing over time, not as rejection, but as distance calls happen less often. Conversations felt more guarded, not hostile, just heavier. And that heaviness was new. Looking back, now Ron doesn't believe anyone set out to change. Hollywood did what it always does. It amplified what it rewarded. Voices that were loud got louder, positions that were firm became fixed, the industry stopped asking questions and started issuing answers. Ron stayed quieter by nature. He focused in the work, believing stories could speak without explanation. Rob leaned into clarity. Both paths made sense into their own way, but they didn't always run parallel anymore. Ron is careful when he talks about this because he understands how easily reflection can sound like judgment. He doesn't want that. He's not rewriting history to make anyone look better or worse. He's simply acknowledging something people rarely admit out loud, that shared journeys didn't always end at the same destination, and that doesn't mean anyone failed. It means time did what time always does. What Ron finds hardest to explain is the feeling that came later. The feeling that Hollywood no longer trusted ambiguity. As a filmmaker, Ron always believed audiences were smarter than the industry gave them credit for. He believed people could sit with complexity, wrestle with emotion, and walk away without being told what to think in. That belief shaped his work. It also shaped how he viewed Rob Reiner's evolution, not as betrayal, but as a response to an environment that demanded certainty. There were moments Ron vividly. Moments that never made it into interviews or retrospectives, a glance exchanged when a conversation stalled, a laugh that felt forced, a silence that lingered a little too long. Those are the things that stay with him. Now, not the public debates or the noise, because those quiet shifts are where truth usually hides. At this stage in his life, Ron Howard isn't interested in settling narratives. He's interested in honesty. In honesty, he's learned, is rarely dramatic, that it's often disappointing in a quiet way, not because something went wrong, but because something ended without anyone announcing it. Friendships don't always break. Sometimes they simply fade, leaving behind respect mixed with distance. When Ron reflects on Rob Reiner's legacy, Hito isn't separate the man from the moment he lived in. He believes Rob's impact on cinema is real and lasting. He also believes the industry changed faster than many people realized, and not everyone adjusted the same way. Rondo isn't see himself as having chosen the better path. He sees himself as having chosen the quieter one. There's a humility in the way Ron speaks. Now admits he didn't always understand what was happening while it was happening. Hence brings clarity, but it also brings regret. Not regret over words unsaid, but over assumptions made, over believing that shared history guaranteed shared futures. Hollywood doesn't work that way. It never has. What Ron wants people to understand is that truth is in tailways, hidden behind scandal. Sometimes it's hidden behind politeness, behind professional respect that masks emotional distance, behind the idea that everything is fine because nothing exploded. The truth about Rob Reiner as Ron sees it now isn't about conflict, that it's about divergence. At 71, Ron Howard speaks like someone who has accepted that not every story has a clean ending. Some stories just stop being told. And that's okay. What matters is remembering them honestly, remembering the good without pretending the change didn't happen. Remembering the connection without denying the distance. Hollywood will keep rewriting its own past. It always does. But Ron Howard isn't interested in rewriting that, he's interested in remembering, and in that remembering Rob Reiner isn't a headline or a symbol. He's a colleague, a contemporary, an reminder of a time when the industry felt less certain and more alive. That's the truth. Ron finally allows himself to, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. As Ron Howard continues to look back, what becomes clearer to him? I enter a single moment where everything changed. But a gradual shift that crept in so quietly, most people didn't notice it until it was already normal. Hollywood didn't announce a neural book. It simply began rewarding different instincts. The room didn't feel hostile, just narrower. And when a room narrows, people either adjust their posture or stop entering altogether. Ron remembers a time when conversations with Rob Reiner felt exploratory. They didn't always agree, but disagreement felt safe. There was curiosity on both sides, a willingness to hear something that might challenge your own thinking. That curiosity was the fuel behind so many great films. Off-era stories weren't meant to confirm beliefs. They were meant to test them. Ron felt that shared understanding early on in its why he trusted Rob as a storyteller, but over time, Ron sensed that conversations began arriving with conclusions already attached. Opinions felt less like invitations and more like positions to defend. It wasn't aggressive. It was confident, where curiosity is treated as hesitation and questions are mistaken for weakness. In that environment, choosing silence can feel like surrender, and choosing complexity can feel dangerous. Rob Reiner didn't create that environment. Ron believes he adapted to it. An adaptation is not a flaw. It's human, but adaptation comes with trade-offs. The more certain the message, the less room there is for interpretation. An interpretation to Ron is where audiences find themselves inside Astery. As Rob's public voice grew stronger, Ron noticed something else, quietly fading, the sense of shared uncertainty that once bound filmmakers together, that feeling of all standing in the same fog, trying to make sense of human behavior through art. The fog lifted, but clarity came at a cost. When everyone claims to see clearly, listening becomes optional. Ron doesn't present Rob for choosing his path. Resentment requires blame. And Ron doesn't feel blame fits here. What he feels is loss. Loss of a shared creative language that once allowed very different people to sit at the summitables of an industry that trusted audiences enough to leave conclusions unfinished. As the years passed, Ron realized that some relationships don't end with conflict. They end with acceptance that people you once mirrored no longer reflect you back. Acceptance that admiration can coexist with distance, acceptance that history doesn't owe anyone permanence. Now when Ron Howard speaks about Rob Reiner, what you hear most clearly I scent disappointment. It's understanding that Hollywood didn't just change Rob. It changed everyone. Some lean into the noise. Some stepped away from it. And in between those choices, connections stretched thin. This realization didn't come quickly. It came with age, with watching cycles repeat, with seeing certainty rise, fall, and rise again under new names. Ron learned that the industry always believes it's progressing even when it's narrowing. And that awareness made him more protective of the one thing he called still control. How he told stories for Ron. The truth about Rob Reiner isn't behind controversy or headlines. T lives in the quiet space between who they were and who they became, in the recognition that shared beginnings don't guarantee shared endings, and in the understanding that sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let distance exist without turning it into drama. Torin Howard, that isn't failure. It's realism. After Rob Reiner's death, Ron Howard didn't rush to speak. He noticed how quickly the world filled the silence for him. Headlines appeared. Clips resurfaced, opinions hardened almost instantly. It reminded Ron of something had always feared about modern remembrance. We didn't leave space for processing anymore. We summarize lives before the echo has even faded. When Ron finally allowed himself to think about Rob without the noise, what surprised him most was how vivid the early memory still felt. Not the premieres or the applause, but the smaller moments. Sitting in rooms where ideas were unfinished, where nobody was trying to win an argument, where success hadn't yet taught them how to protect themselves, those memories returned with an H that wasn't sharp but constant. Ron realized that death has a way of stripping narratives down to essentials. It doesn't care about public positions or controversies. It reduces a life to patterns, choices, shifts. Ron Howard no longer measured life by milestones or accolades. He measured it by who was still there and by how carefully he held on to them. The impact of natural disaster and social tragedy. By the time Ron Howard reached his late 60s, loss no longer came only through personal relationships. It arrived through the world around him. It came through communities erased overnight, through neighbors displaced, and through a growing sense that stability itself had become fragile. In 2020, Howard released the documentary Rebuilding Paradise, which examined the aftermath of the 2018 campfire that destroyed the town of Paradise, California. The project was not born from professional obligation. Howard was drawn to the history because it mirrored fears he had already been carrying. Entire families lost homes in hours. Familiar streets vanished. Lives were permanently altered without warning. Howard later described the experience of making the film as emotionally exhausting. He listened to survivors recount how they fled with nothing. He watched communities attempt to rebuild while still in shock. Although he was not personally affected by that fire, the proximity mattered. It forced him to confront how quickly safety could disappear. Even for people who believed they were prepared. That fear became more personal in 2025 when wildfires again threatened areas of Los Angeles. Several of Howard's friends lost their homes. Others were displaced for weeks. Howard's own house was spared, as was the home of longtime friend and collaborator Henry Winkler, but the relief was tempered by guilt. Howard referred to the situation as a life-changing blow. Not because of what he lost, but because of what so many others did. What stayed with him was not destruction, but response. Neighbors opened doors. Strangers organized relief. Communities reassembled themselves from nothing. For Howard, this reinforced a belief that had been forming for years. Individual success meant little without collective resilience. The experience deepened his interest in socially grounded storytelling and reinforced his commitment to projects that centered on recovery rather than spectacle. At the same time, Howard was confronting a different kind of modern tragedy. Between 2025 and 2026, a wave of online content began framing his life as a spectacle of suffering. YouTube videos carried titles such as, "The Tragedy of Ron Howard is Beyond Heartbreaking." Some linked unrelated losses into a single narrative. Others went further. In December 2025, a false report claiming Howard had died began circulating online. The hoax spread quickly before being debunked. Howard did